Okay. Okay, so hopefully everyone can see my screen okay. Okay. All right, well, like I said, this is our third and final part in our elevation certificate series. We are going to be talking about sections C, D, and E today, mostly focusing on section C. So I know some of you have seen this slide maybe once or twice before, but since some people are taking it separately, I will go ahead and cover it one more time. So what is the elevation certificate and how is it used? Well, it has to be signed and sealed by a licensed land surveyor or a professional engineer. Architects are not allowed to sign and seal them in Kansas, even though the instructions on the elevation certificate say that they can. This is a state-to-state rule, so architects can do floodproofing, but they cannot sign elevation certificates. We use them to show that sites are on natural ground above the base flood elevation. And so when some people see this on their elevation certificate that their lowest adjacent grade is higher than the base flood elevation, they assume that it automatically takes them out of the floodplain. That is not true. So we need to do our best to make sure that citizens understand they need the LOMA paperwork submitted, reviewed, and approved by FEMA to officially come out of the floodplain legally, to get out of floodplain regulations and the mandatory insurance purchase requirement. We also have communities using them to verify that properties are built to the correct elevation. So this is not changing. This is written into our regulations that we have this certified information to verify compliance. And again, floodplain management is not changing. We can find the elevation certificate at FEMA.gov. So the new information is that the elevation certificate is now optional for flood insurance under risk rating 2.0. So the risk rating engine has a first floor height tool to determine what that height is, based on the property location. And if the tool doesn't work, then they can make assumptions about what that height is based on the foundation type. So if the policyholder isn't happy with those numbers, then they can submit an elevation certificate voluntarily to try to get a better first floor height number. And they can also self-certify an elevation certificate using sections A, B, E, and F in any flood zone now. Again, that's only for insurance. It has nothing to do with compliance with our regulations. So these are just insurance rating changes. Okay, so we have these terms and it's really important that we know what they mean. So what is the top of the bottom floor? What is a basement? So the top of the bottom floor in a basement is the floor of the basement, where I'm coming to you live right now in a basement. I'm on the floor of the basement, which means the top of the bottom floor. We have had a situation where a property owner built a basement in the floodplain and then said the ceiling was the top of the bottom floor in the basement. So this was an honest mistake that caused a very big violation problem. So this is why we need to make sure that we understand what these terms mean and what they mean on the elevation certificate. So the lowest floor means the lowest floor of the lowest enclosed area that includes a basement, whether it's finished or unfinished. Same thing with a crawl space. It's the floor of the enclosure is the lowest floor, and that's for C2A. So we need to make sure that we are, filling out that for the lowest floor. And then first floor height, again, so this is something new for insurance. We're not necessarily looking at the lowest floor. First floor height is the height of a building's first lowest floor that's above the adjacent grade. So we're not necessarily looking at a basement floor anymore. In that elevation, we're looking at the first floor height and in combination with their foundation type. So that is a change. Again, the elevation certificate is not changing. Floodplain management is not changing. We did have surveyors who may in the past have thought they were helping out property owners by putting false information into an elevation certificate to help with insurance costs. However, that doesn't help anybody. It only causes problems. So we don't want to see that. And maybe under risk grading 2.0, that won't happen since we're looking at the first lowest floor above the adjacent grade. Okay. So we're here to start talking about section C, first of all. So we'll start with C1. So this is all of our elevation information. So section A is our building and property information, section B is our mapping information, and then section C is all of our elevation information. So C1, what kind of elevation certificate are we filling out? Is it based on construction drawings? Is it based on a building that's under construction, or is it finished construction? So everybody needs finished construction elevation certificate, but it may be a good idea to require one of the other two, either on drawings or a building under construction. It can help you verify compliance that when the building is finished, that it will be compliant. Some communities require one of these pre-finished elevation certificates before they'll give a permit. Again, it helps them with compliance, and it's easier to fix a building before it's finished than to try to do so afterwards. So some of them ask for it just after the foundation is poured. It's a good idea to do an inspection right after the foundation is poured. Maybe have the surveyor out there with you, and then you can verify that the foundation has been put in at the right height, because that's a good time to fix a mistake. And it's much easier and cheaper to build a building in compliance after that than it is to try to do it when it's finished. That's a much more complicated and painful process. So we had a case where a stake like this in the photograph was put out in the yard. A surveyor put it out there to mark the proper elevation, and the marking said 2_FT for feet. So 2_ which means 2.4 feet. And then the contractor came out and saw it and thought it meant 2 feet, so 24 inches. So it was built 0.4 of a foot too low, and that's very much a problem. We also had another case in Northeast Kansas where the sneaky property owner came out and saw the stake, and then they decided to drive it into the ground an extra foot. So that's not good. And then when the contractor came out, they built it to that level. And then when the surveyor came out, the property owner was trying to have them just sign off on the elevation certificate, but the surveyor didn't do that. They went out and remeasured, and they saw what had happened. They knew the stake had been altered, and they filled out a new elevation certificate. So it's a good thing to verify these. I don't know what we could do about a property owner that does something like that, but it has happened. And it's not the surveyor's fault. It's not the community official's fault. It's just something that happened and can happen. So we should be aware of situations like that. So here's a building that's clearly not finished construction, so it should definitely not be marked in C1 as finished construction. This is a restaurant that's going to have a drive-through, so it's a non-residential building. It's clearly not finished, but the surveyor has control over what is technically finished and what's unfinished. So we had a case where a surveyor marked the elevation certificate as being for a building under construction because the light covers, or the light switches inside the house didn't have the switch covers on it. So we don't get involved in that. It's the surveyor who has, calling the shots on the certificate. I would think of finished construction as whether the surfaces, on the outside and the inside of the house, such as like the floor and maybe the veneer on the outside, not all that kind of stuff is finished or not, but again, they call the shots on that. So line C2, this is our benchmark information. So we've seen benchmarks before. I think the older ones, it's mostly older ones, are where you see the metal disc that are stamped with the information, and it gives you, the date that it was put in there and things like that. I guess Steve has seen a couple of them at the Wildlife Refuge in Emporia. I have seen them on bridges and telephone poles. So they're kind of all over the place, but every benchmark should have a unique identifier number, and then you can find them registered on the National Geodetic Survey website. So this is very helpful. All this new technology, we can now verify benchmarks in a much more efficient way. So we should definitely have a unique identifier on that line, and absolutely check the vertical datum and make sure it's in line with the rest of the vertical datums that are used on the elevation certificate, whether that means you have to convert them or not. So we have seen this line marked with a very basic description that doesn't say where it was in the comments, and that's not a very good identifier. So if you don't know that information about a particular benchmark, again, you can go to the National Geodetic Survey website. They have an interactive map. So I'll show you that in a couple of slides, but you can look it up and you can verify all of that information. So it's very handy to look at that website. Again, it's asking for the vertical datum, so make sure that's checked and don't accept an elevation certificate that was missing that information. So that would be the National Geodetic Vertical Datum of 1929 or the North American Vertical Datum of 1988. The benchmark should say, or the data sheet for the benchmark will tell you that. You can also tell if the benchmark is not going to be an NAVD if it was put in pre-1988. So the NGVD system was based on mean sea level from records from Coast Guards over a very long time, which is good, except mean sea level are very different on our different coasts. So from the Pacific to the Atlantic to the Gulf are very different numbers. So it's not a very good measurement tool, which is why in 1988 we had a new datum that was created, and we've been using NAVD pretty much exclusively since 2005. So again, the datum that the map is in and the flood insurance study will both have that information in there. So definitely check the box and definitely verify that your BFE datum in section B on line B9 is the same. They have to be lined up, otherwise you've got a very big problem with your elevation information. So again, we've got a very interactive map for the NGS where you can get the full data sheet. So this is their homepage on the website. You just go here and then select a retrieval method, interactive map. So you just go there, you open it up, and there's like a find list selection on the left-hand panel, and then you can just zoom into the city, the area where you're working, and then they've got all of the different registered benchmarks there, and you can open it up. It'll tell you all the information about it. It gives you the datum, how that was determined, what it looks like, a description. It's usually got some kind of land description, a legal description of where it is, and sometimes there's photographs. And so you have that full data sheet. It's very nice, it's very organized. So we should all be able to use this and have that information verified. FEMA stopped adding this information to the maps. FEMA turned over all of the benchmark responsibility onto the NGS. So this is the note that you'll find on the maps in the user notes, that if you have any questions about the benchmarks, to go ahead and just get in contact with the Information Services branch of the NGS. So they used to get a lot of questions about it, and they just wanted the NGS to deal with it. So that's what they did. So here's an older style map. This is for the city of Ellis, and this is actually still their current effective map until this upcoming June. So this is the note on the index about the reference marks. So there used to be a lot of issues because these reference marks, these little landmarks can be moved around or something can happen to them. So if we look at RM1, North Cat Bolt on top flange of fire hydrant located on the northwest corner of West 10th Street and Fateau Street. I don't know if I'm saying that right. So these things can be moved around. You know, a fire hydrant might get moved as the city changes and develops over time. This map is from 1983, so there's a very good chance that that's not there anymore. Reference mark 2 is a nail in the top of the first fence post east of the middle entrance of St. Mary's Cemetery on East 6th Street. So if we think about just a nail in a fence post from 1983, I was born in the 90s and I'm 30 now, so that's been a very long time ago. It could easily have rusted out. That fence post could have been replaced. Other people could have nailed things into that post, you know, any number of things. So this is not a very good reference mark, especially, you know, with how much time has passed. There's no unique identifiers for it. We've seen things like this before on elevation certificates, such as spike in tree without any other information about where it was or what kind of tree it was. So now that we have, you know, helpful tools like the interactive map with all this information in it, we don't have to rely on, you know, these older versions anymore. So that is good, and we should all be doing that. And so speaking of technological advances, surveys can now be shot using the Opus online positioning user service. So again, this is on the NGS website. You can find information about this service. So it's good for surveying. I've been told it's easy to use for surveyors. You've got your antenna out there and then the space station signals. So if you use the Opus, you're going to want to put a note about that in the comments, and then you're going to want to attach the Opus report to the elevation certificate. And if you're a community official that's reviewing an elevation certificate and you see this in the comments, then you're going to want to make sure that you have that report or request that report for it. So the website here has a lot of information about how to use this service, a lot of information and advice about how to make sure it's as accurate as possible, such as shooting in clear weather, waiting a day to submit your finals, how to properly calibrate the antenna and avoid those mistakes. And so if you do all of that the right way, it should be accurate to within just a couple of centimeters. So another helpful tool. So again, with the datum, it should absolutely match B9. So even if you have to convert it, that's okay. So this map is showing us the difference between the two datums all the way across the country. So in Kansas, it could be 20 or 40 difference in centimeters. So that's a big mistake to be made with a building that's built too low. Very serious to deal with, and it's just a headache for everyone and can be very expensive. So this is really important to make sure that that matches up. And again, if they're different, you should convert them and then put that information in the comments section. So here's what the NCAT looks like. NGS coordinate and transformation tool. So it looks pretty straightforward about getting that converted. So yeah, it used to be VertCon, now it's NCAT. So section C2. So the rest of C2, A through H is our elevation information. We don't want to see any spaces left blank. If something doesn't apply, we want to see an A on the line. That way we know you didn't just skip it or miss it, that it's being considered and it doesn't apply. And then when we're reviewing the elevation certificate, we're going to want to check this information against the building diagrams in case you have questions and to verify that the correct diagrams have been used. Again, you have those sketches of the different diagrams in the instructions that can be very helpful in visualizing things when you're looking at a certificate, because I'm a very visual person myself. So when I look at an elevation certificate, sometimes it doesn't all fit together in a visual way. So those sketches can help put the picture together of what you're looking at. So we've got the top of the bottom floor, which we've talked about a little bit, and then the next higher floor. C2C is for V zones only. We don't have any in Kansas, so this will always be NA, not applicable. C2D for the attached garage. If there is no attached garage, then please put NA on that. A bank will have issues with this and think you forgot about the garage if you leave it blank. So make sure that that is fixed. And then C2E is the lowest elevation of machinery and equipment servicing the building. So we definitely need that information here, and then a description of what that machinery and equipment is and where it is in the comments section. And actually right under C2E in parentheses on the certificate, it says to do that. It's not even in the instructions, it's right there on the certificate with C2E. And then C2F, our lowest adjacent grade. Of course, this is important for a LOMA in support of that. This can also be used in part of the one mitigation discount under risk grading 2.0. So it's still an important number. And then C2G is our highest adjacent grade. So this is a more important number for section E. And then we have C2H, which is the lowest adjacent grade of a deck or stairs. So we're going to want to measure the post of that or those stairs, and it's still going to come into play for a LOMA. So it's an important number as well. So sometimes building with a crawl space foundation is not accessible. It's usually accessible, but sometimes it's not. So if you look in the instructions, they have these suggestions or instructions on how that should be measured if you can't get access to it. So for the first example, you get a yardstick and then you measure from the height of the crawl space to the next higher floor, and then you subtract the crawl space from the next higher floor elevation. Or sometimes the local floodplain administrator or someone in the community might have information like this from the building permit that was issued. Or the property owner could have documentation, or they might know information about their crawl space. You can also look in through the openings or the vents. So if you have to use something like this, then you're going to want to explain it in the comments section D. There may also be interior access to the crawl space from inside the house, so that might also be an option. Either way, you should try to explain how the crawl space elevations were obtained. So here is section C2, the whole thing, I guess, except for line C1, but this is all of C2. So again, we're gonna go ahead and fill in C2C for you. It's not applicable in Kansas. And then make sure that you check the measurements. So in the continental United States, we don't like the metric system. We're not switching over. So we're definitely need to be using feet. The instructions say Puerto Rico only. It says right here at the top under C2 in Puerto Rico only for meters. I think we have had one case where someone did this all in meters. Of course, that's going to very much throw off all of the information. So it needs to be in feet here in Kansas. So we were able to get a new copy filled out. So definitely make sure everything is in feet. So some common mistakes that we see in section C. The top of the bottom floor is not actually the lowest enclosure or the lowest floor, which would mean the basement if there's a basement, or a cellar. And it doesn't matter if it's unfinished. We had a surveyor say that it wouldn't matter if that area flooded because it was an unfinished area. They wanted to help with the insurance. But that doesn't help anyone, and it doesn't matter. That's the top of the bottom floor, and we need to use it. I haven't actually experienced that, but Steve has told me all these horror stories. So C2B, so we have a 2-story house where that line is blank, or they've put in the same number as C2A. Of course, if there is no next higher floor, then it should be marked as NA. We've seen C2C left blank, C2E left blank. So if that's left blank, then definitely something is wrong. We need that information. We need that elevation, even if it's something that's just on the roof, or all of it's on the roof as the lowest machinery and equipment. So if you see this left blank, then it needs to be fixed. Or if you see NA in this line, then definitely double check that there's no machinery and equipment. And then of course, lowest adjacent grade is very important for our LOMA. So this is where you can compare C2F with B9, which is the base flood elevation, to see if they're eligible for a LOMA. Because again, we've seen LOMAs help solve violation issues, so that is one option. Again, we can't tell people that a LOMA is going to help them with their insurance because it doesn't help with insurance anymore. It doesn't impact your premium, but it will get you out of the purchase requirements and floodplain regulations. And then highest adjacent grade, again, that's more important for the section E that's filled out by someone who's not a licensed surveyor or engineer. And then we have C2H that should have a number in it if there is a deck or stairs, or if it should have an NA if there are not, and it should not be left blank. So we looked at these a lot from our section A class. These are the diagram sketches from the instructions, and it does show you where to measure these points. So there's no problem, pulling these out while you're out in the field. Could be helpful to you just to double check everything. It never hurts to check yourself. So we saw an elevation certificate for a building with a basement. So we had C2A, the top of the bottom floor at 1,010.4 feet. And then the base flood elevation below that at 1,007.6 feet. And then the lowest adjacent grade was at 1,005.2 feet. So how can we have a basement that's below ground if it's not below the lowest adjacent grade? So we had pictures that showed the window wells in the foundation to the basement. And so we know the lowest adjacent grade was not filled out correctly, which should be at the bottom of those window wells. So comparing these numbers can help us verify mistakes that were made and the correct building diagram that should be used. So we did look at these again in section A, but now we're going to look at them in interest of their elevation information. So this is a diagram 1A. This is a slab on grade. So the sketch shows you the top of the slab of this house. C2A is the top of the bottom floor, and then that's where you should be measuring. And then C2D is the top of the garage floor. So we do have an attached garage here, so we should be measuring from the top of the garage floor for that part. And then C2B would be NA on this house because there is no next higher floor. And then here's the back view of the same house. So C2E would be here, pointed out with their lowest machinery and equipment. It's on a little metal stand. We did already talk about mitigation credits. This house would not be getting any because that should be elevated to their attic level or higher. I do have that slide in here that I'll show you later a little bit. And then C2A is right there pointed out at the top of the slab. So again, we're talking about window wells with a basement. It's going to be at the bottom of those window wells for the lowest adjacent grade. Of course, we do have the potential intervening higher ground that can help with a LOMA. So we're going to want to put that in section D, or like I showed you before, you can make a sketch, or the surveyor can make a sketch of the house with the window wells and that elevation, and then draw in the intervening higher ground and just very clearly demonstrate how it's working and how the higher ground is going to stop floodwater from getting in there. So that has worked before. So just put that information in section D. It is important for the LOMA. Again, not going to impact the insurance, but there's other reasons why people still want a LOMA. And then there's another example with the raised slab on grade building. So it's like a loading dock. So there's loading bay doors where the brick is, and then the semi truck can back up so they're even with each other, and they can very easily load and unload equipment. So the lowest adjacent grade is pointed out there, and that's the bottom where the flood water would be touching the foundation of the building, and that's why that is the lowest adjacent grade at the bottom. And again, we still have potential intervening higher ground that could be helpful with a LOMA. So here's a picture of that, just that the loading bay doors, and then the raised slab on grade, and then the lowest adjacent grade would be down there at that bottom of the slab. And then in comments, you have this intervening higher ground. So there's your real life case example. And then C2E, what is it and where is it? So we've seen a lot of people elevate their houses and then just have a slab on the ground on the outside where they put their utilities, which doesn't really make any sense. We should be protecting our utilities just as much as the rest of our investment. And on this particular one, you can see the debris line where it was inundated, like almost all the way up to the top. And so FEMA did a study a couple years ago and found out they were paying out a lot of claims on HVAC units that were left outside on the ground. So they changed that to now where we elevate utilities, and then it's part of an important part of our grant that we're making sure that communities have people elevating their utilities as well. And it makes sense to do that. You don't want to leave them on the ground where they're susceptible to flooding. Okay, so here's the machinery and equipment slide that I was talking about. Some of you have seen this, but some of you may not. So it's adjacent to filling out an elevation certificate, that this is where the machinery and equipment may come in if they voluntarily submit an elevation certificate for the insurance. So if you have a slab on grade, so it's a 1A, a 1B, or 3, you have the machinery equipment elevated to the height of the attic if it's 1 floor. If there's more than 1 floor, then it's got to be to the height of the 2nd floor or higher. With a basement, it's to the floor above the basement or higher. If you have a diagram 5, 6, or 7, so elevated without an enclosure, with an enclosure, or on a full story enclosure, then it has to be to the lowest elevated floor or higher. And if you have a crawl space, it's got to be to the floor above the crawl space or higher. So no one's going to be penalized for not elevating their machinery and equipment as far as insurance. Of course, that's still a compliance issue, but it's not going to increase your premium at all. You just won't be getting the 5% discount. So it used to be, if you left your utilities on the floor of your garage, it could potentially change your entire rating floor to the garage. That no longer applies. Your machinery and equipment is not going to impact your rating floor. So yeah, it's really just about mitigation discounts, and that's the only question that they're asking about machinery and equipment on the insurance application. And so for building coverage, this is your AC, your furnace, your heat pump, your water heater, and any elevator equipment. For contents coverage, it's your clothes, washer and dryer, and your food freezers. So that's it. Of course, like I said, it's still a compliance issue. Floodplain management is not changing, and there's still a violation that we're going to have to deal with if people don't elevate it high enough. So FEMA has some really good classes. These are independent study classes online. So you just register for a student number on the EMI Emergency Management Institute. So you can just search for those keywords. It should pull it up, and you just sign up for it. So they're very good. They're very detailed. 1105 and 1102 are aimed more at insurance agents. So they do have some more outdated information about flood insurance. Like in 1105, lesson 2 is all about the lowest floor elevation, which we, insurance agents don't care about as much. And, as surveyors, 1103 is aimed more at surveying. So it has less outdated information because surveyors are not as close to insurance as the agents are. So it's more surveying focus. There are still a couple of slides that are outdated, but hopefully you understand which parts still apply to flood insurance and which don't. Of course, I would recommend looking at the new flood insurance manual to help clear up any questions about that. And of course, we are here for that. And, we're getting farther away from elevation certificates and insurance together because they're optional for flood insurance. And I was talking about first floor height at the beginning of the presentation, and some of you have seen this slide, but I'll just cover it quickly. So the rating floor for a slab on grade 1A, 1B, or 3 is the first floor of the building. Building with a basement, it's 2A, 2B, or 4 diagrams. It's going to be the first floor above the basement. If you have a 5, which is elevated without an enclosure, it's your first elevated floor. And then 6, 7, 8, or 9 have the same rules. So the 3 boxes on the bottom are the same. So they'll be using the floor of the enclosure if it's a pre-firm building in any zone, or if it's not in a special flood hazard area, or if it's in an approximate unnumbered A zone, A99, AO, AR/AO, or unnumbered V zone. And then they'll use the elevated floor for rating if it's a post-firm building and it's in one of these floodplains, a numbered A zone, AE, AH, AR, and then the combination of flood zones that you see at the bottom, numbered V zones or VE zones. So this is part of their push for equity and everyone paying their fair share and their attempts to simplify flood insurance. So I just wanted to show you a little bit more about the relationship between the rating floor and the elevation certificate. Again, these are from the flood insurance manual that came out in October. So the slab on grade buildings, it's your C2A. So that's the top of the bottom floor. Like I said, it's just a slab on grade. And then for a building with a basement, it's your next higher floor, which of course would be the floor above the basement. So it's C2B. And if there's not a C2B, then you can use C2A plus 8 feet. And then again, 6, 7, 8, or 9 have the same rules. So if it's the pre-firm or non-special flood hazard area and the approximate floodplain, then it's the C2A. And if it's a post-firm and it's in one of those combinations or the numbered A zone or numbered V or VE, it's the next higher floor. So that's the C2B. And so that's how they're using the elevation certificate a little bit. Of course, we don't have C2C in Kansas. We talked about that. And so the message that we still have is, building higher does save you money on your premium. We just don't have rating tables or exact numbers anymore because the risk rating engine has too many variables and it's too complicated to give anyone an exact number. So our 1 foot of freeboard requirement across the state is not changing. Of course, there's no substitute for elevation, and that's still true. You're still less likely to get flooded or sustain damage the higher you build. And if people want to know specific numbers for a mitigation project or a new construction project, then they will have to run through those scenarios with an insurance agent. And that's really the only guidance we can give them because we don't have access to the rating engine. I would like to see it, but only insurance agents have it. So here is an actual elevation certificate that we're going to look at, and there are some problems here. So first of all, line A7, our building diagram number just says 2. So what happened was this was a surveyor that was familiar with some of the older versions of the elevation certificate. And that was before they added in the A and B distinction between different types of basements. So they weren't familiar with that and they just filled it out the same way they used to. So we know it's some kind of a basement, either just subgrade on all sides or subgrade with the patio opening in the basement. So we have that, and then we have A9, an attached garage that's 900 square feet, and then there are 0 flood openings in it. So it's not a compliant garage, it's a violation. We need the 1-to-1 rule. And then they also filled out the information for a crawl space, although the foundation is not a crawl space. It says 1680 square feet for the enclosure, and then only 480 square inches in openings. So again, it's got to be 1 square inch per every 1 square foot of enclosed space. So it should be at least 1680. So again, not good. That's not enough openings. And then B9, our base flood elevation is 1180.4. This is a community derived base flood elevation. And then if you look at C2A, we've got 1179.5. So we are 9/10 of a foot below the base flood elevation. And so this was a new building that was just built all incorrectly. So C2B is 1185.0, which is above the base flood elevation, which is good. I mean, we are looking at first floor height, the floor above the basement as a rating variable, but the foundation also comes into play there. So it's still not a good situation. Of course, in floodplain management, it's not a compliant situation. And then our saving grace here is our lowest adjacent grade is 1181.8. So that is above the base flood elevation. So they are eligible for a LOMA. And if you look at C2H, it's just barely above the base flood elevation, but that's enough to reach eligibility. And like I said before, we've seen LOMAs swoop in and save the day on some compliance issues. So it's good for them to get out of an expensive violation issue. It's not the best option for safety. They're still going to be very close adjacent to the floodplain, and bigger floods are and will be happening. So it's still not a great situation to have a basement right there. But as far as legality and compliance, this will work. And as far as there being a crawl space on this building, if you look at C2A and C2B, the difference there is 5.5 feet, 5.5 feet. And as I mentioned yesterday, anything over 5 feet is considered a full story. So it's not a crawl space. It's not a diagram 9. And again, a diagram 9 has special conditions. The ordinance has to be adopted with these certain regulations to have that. And there's all these stipulations about a subgrade crawl space. So that's not the case here. But again, getting a LOMA will fix these issues. So one last time on the mitigation discounts. So elevated machinery equipment to the height specified based on your foundation will get you a flat 5% discount. Proper flood venting in the appropriate foundations will get you between a 3 and 27% discount. And that's dependent on all of your other variables where that discount is going to land as far as percentage. And then you can get a mitigation discount based on your lowest adjacent grade, your first floor height, and your foundation type in combination with your other variables. And I don't have numbers on that. So these are the 3 possible discounts that you could get under risk rating 2.0. Okay, so section D. This is not a difficult section. So you just fill in your information and then your license number and all of that, and you sign and seal it. But what's important here is the comments. Every certificate should definitely have comments in it. So here's some of the important ones that should be included. That would be the location and a description of what the lowest machinery and equipment is from C2E or from E4. Engineered flood openings, there should be a model number in there, description. They should have a certificate that comes with them that talks about their rating and all of that, so that should be attached. The benchmark information, of course, your unique identifier number, and the description of what that benchmark is. So interior grade for the openings, if you had to use the adjacent grade from the interior, if that was done, put that in the comments. If you had to convert the datum and you use the NCAT tool, then put that in there. If you weren't able to get into the crawl space the normal way and you had to use one of the suggestions or instructions from the elevation certificate instructions, then put that in there. If this is an under construction certificate, then how far under construction was it? At what stage was it? So for section G1, the data source, if the community official put in information from a different data source, which is a rare occurrence, but the base flood elevation or other elevation information from a source, then that should be written in. Of course, any relevant information that's not specifically asked for, such as, when we talked about mixed foundations, which goes right across there with unusual buildings. So things like that, anything that should be known to clear up any confusion about something unusual. Yeah, anything that needs to be explained. And so for section E, that should be on natural grade. And if it's not for some reason, then that should be explained. So we have seen a building that had, see, it was like slab on grade on one side and then a slope, and where the slope came in, they built in a crawl space on the other side, which is similar to what I talked about with the raised slab on grade and an office building that had a crawl space. It's something like that, where there's two different types of foundation. Explain that. Okay, and about that signature, I'm sure any surveyor on here knows this, that you are liable, you're putting your license on here, and it is a crime to put any false information on an elevation certificate. It's a crime. You could face prison time or a fine. So I really doubt anyone on this call has done something like that. I think Steve has only told me about one particular surveyor that he believes falsified information on purpose, but of course we don't want to see that. And false information usually gets found out, and it's not going to help with insurance costs. It's only going to create problems. And like I said, maybe with risk rating 2.0 and the changes in insurance rating, it would lessen the incentive if anyone were to be tempted to put in false information. But yeah, personally, I have not seen that. So section E, anyone can fill out this section, and anyone can fill out this section for any zone for insurance purposes only. For compliance, it's still only the AO zone. It does say zone A, but here in Kansas, we have to have that base flood elevation in a zone A calculated. And I went through that yesterday, how to do that, how to get that, and how we put those cross sections into our newer maps. So check with us on that. But for AO zones, so if there's no number specified on the map for that flood depth, it's 2 feet. So you find the highest adjacent grade and you measure to the floor of the building, and it's got to be at least 24 inches, 2 feet. So anyone can do this with a yardstick. You don't need a GPS or a surveyor, anybody. Of course, we still have the 1 foot above requirement in Kansas, and we talked about that. And then again, risk rating 2.0 with the optional elevation certificate will go with the number that's most favorable to the policyholder. Okay. And then, so here's a snippet of that language where it says at least 2 feet if no depth is specified. Some of our CRS communities and other communities have sometimes put in at least 2 feet if no depth is specified plus 1 foot of freeboard to give that extra freeboard language. It's a requirement for CRS class 8 or higher. But of course, it's not a bad idea. Always more freeboard is always safer. So yeah, here's the rest of that language. And yeah, zone A has to have a BFE calculated. So CRS hands out this elevation certificate checklist to their communities. So the blocks that are yellow have to be filled out and complete and accurate. Yeah, for Kansas, we need all of them, of course. So I can send out this checklist if you like to see it. And of course, if you receive something that has blanks in it or it's incorrect, don't feel like you have to accept it. Don't feel obligated to do anything. Of course, hold back the permit. The permit is on the condition of meeting compliance always. So you can usually work with the surveyors. So it's a good idea to have a good working relationship there. And of course, we can help as well. So this is not part of the elevation certificate, but of course, any work in the floodway does need a no rise certificate. And this will often serve as a deterrent to people who want to build in the floodway, because getting an engineer to do this whole hydraulic information and certify it can be quite expensive. So we like to see people not develop the floodway. Again, definitely required for any work in the floodway, so make sure that you get one of these. Yep. And then fill. So fill in the floodplain, you definitely need to check with our engineer, Janelle, to see if a state permit would be required for putting fill in the floodplain. Yeah, so they could also get a LOMR F by building on fill, as long as they're above the base flood elevation. And then we have our crawl space foundation with openings. And then accessory structures. So this is a shed, and we do have to have an elevation certificate on something like this to verify that the utilities are above the base flood elevation. That's in our regulations. Otherwise, you might not need one. So you can see this is has the proper flood openings and is properly anchored. But yeah, we still need an elevation certificate for something. And it should be on its own certificate if it's not attached to the house. So here's a picture of one. It's elevated. It has an AC unit in there. It might have other utilities inside. Just guessing based on it having an AC unit. So you want to verify that, of course. Make sure it's all the utilities are above the base flood elevation. And again, this is a detached garage. So the regulations say that detached garage can be exempted from insurance as part of a loan. But as floodplain managers, whether there's an insurance issue or not, we still have to have a permit and verify with an elevation certificate that it was built in compliance. And then of course, the elevation certificate instructions are very helpful. We are here if you need help with anything. And so if you want to learn more, our floodplain webpage for KDA is a good resource. Oh, there's Steve's number there. My number is on the next slide. We also work with Don Masterson, who's assigned to Kansas. His information is there. We work with him quite frequently. So to find your map that I talked about yesterday, it's msc.fema.gov that you can find it. You can make a ferment. That's very useful. FEMA's online library, which seems to move around web pages, but they have a lot of very useful publications that can help a lot with context and how to do certain things. And then the NGS number is there for benchmark information, and their website is also very helpful. We got floodsmart.gov, which is a website that's being rebuilt because there was a whole fiasco over who owned the name FloodSmart. So it's getting to be a good, useful resource. Definitely get to know your local floodplain managers, the community officials, get to know the surveyors. There should be a good working relationship there, to get elevation certificates done and correct. And so that line of communication should be open for when there's questions or we need corrections or more information. And then we have a video of Steve on YouTube doing an elevation certificate demonstration on different building diagrams and where things are and how the elevation certificate should be filled out. So that's good for visual learners. I found it helpful when learning about certificates. And then we have the Army Corps of Engineers at the bottom. So yeah, that wraps up the last part of our course. So I will stop the recording and stop sharing my screen. Sorry about that. Okay, stop recording.